Hello and welcome to the channel. My name's Matthew King and I'm here with my faithful canine assistant, Loki. And we're recording this evening on the eve of the release of Maestro, a film about Leonard Bernstein with Bradley Cooper in the starring role and Kerry Mulligan playing the role of Felicia, his wife. I haven't seen the film yet, of course, but I'm very much looking forward to it. I thought it would be a good opportunity to say a few things about Bernstein. This isn't going to be a long film, but it would be nice to just reflect on one of the iconic figures of classical music well, not just classical music, one of the iconic figures of music in the 20th century. Benjamin Britten once said that there are three key components in the production of music. One is the composer, one is the performer, and the third is the audience. He said that they were equal in importance. And Bernstein instinctively knew this. He was a composer of extraordinary gifts, West Side Story perhaps being his crowning achievement, but there are many other wonderful pieces. Prelude, Fugue and Riffs, for example, absolute masterpiece. So Bernstein, the composer, then there was Bernstein, the conductor. Well, he is unquestionably one of the most important conductors of the 20th century. Hugely charismatic on the podium, but also prodigiously musical. Any recording where you might see him rehearsing is a pleasure to watch. He has a razor-sharp perception about what's going on in the orchestra and an absolute understanding of the music that he's conducting, a real insight into every score.
Please, you must watch. It's so free. It's got to be like one person singing his heart out, and you're playing like an exercise.
And then the third category, the audience category in Benjamin Britten's famous analogy. Well, Bernstein absolutely understood about audience, and perhaps more than any other conductor in the 20th century, made it his business to come alongside the audience, famously in those concerts in New York, often with young people.
This last piece we're going to play, you'll just have to pretend that I'm young too. As a matter,
he would speak in a very persuasive and engaging way at the beginning. But there are also wonderful videos that you can see on YouTube of Bernstein talking in various capacities as an educator, speaking to audiences in the most engaging and charismatic way. Famously his Harvard lectures, but there are many examples of him talking which are still, they haven't really dated. I mean, they've only dated insofar as sometimes he's holding a cigarette or something. But he's marvellously insightful about music, and there's something unguarded, informal about the way that he speaks so perceptively about the music that he's about to conduct usually. And of course, Bernstein was also a pianist, a really capable. I should go further. I mean, a really good pianist. I don't know if he practiced as much as he should have done, but my goodness, performances that I've heard him give of Rhapsody in Blue, for example, are really rather good. So he was all-round star performer and creator. And communicator. I mean, what more do you want from a professional musician? Prodigious figure and a legend, and really deserves his status. So it'll be interesting to see what the film has to say. I think the film focuses on his private life more than his musical accomplishments, but there we are, that's the nature of film. And what I have seen of Bradley Cooper, just a tiny preview of Bradley Cooper, in one scene, I thought he had an uncanny resemblance to Bernstein, not only physically. I know there's been a lot of controversy about his prosthetic nose, but I didn't really notice it. He just looked a bit like Bernstein to me. And he also sounded like Bernstein. The voice was remarkably accurate.
The creative person sits alone in this great studio that you see here. And
so let's focus our attention on that famous piece of Bernstein, West Side Story. And I'm not proposing to say too much. This is just a little sort of appetizer for those of you who are watching this who know West Side Story. And there are people, of course, who don't know it, and I suggest that you do watch it. Both film versions are marvellous. There's the 1961 version, and then there's the much more recent Steven Spielberg version from a couple of years ago, and both films are marvellous. I wanted to focus on something almost like an academic feature of the score, which is the marvellous way in which the music seems to represent human strife or conflict in a fascinating way. The story of West Side Story is a very human one and a very topical one. It's about tribal conflict. It's about absolutely intransigent hostility between two rival gangs in New York, ostensibly in the early 1960s, the Jets and the Sharks. And these two groups have an implacable hatred, which is really to do with race and to do with being dispossessed. One group hates the other because they're immigrants and so on. So all these topics we know well, and they seem to be horribly magnified in our own time. And what's striking about the way Bernstein sets it is he seems to understand that tension in a musical way. And he represents it in the score by using unprecedentedly dissonant harmony. It's curious how popular West Side Story is because it makes use of many more of the tropes of avant-garde music, or certainly of serious classical music in the 20th century, dissonant classical music. And Bernstein, of course, was and considered himself to be a serious composer. You know, he's close friends with Aaron Copland, and he'd written a couple of symphonies before West Side Story, and his own music is dissonant. But of course he had another foot in musical theatre, and he had another foot again in jazz, which sort of fascinated him all his life. He was intrigued by the sounds of jazz, the harmony of jazz. And somehow in West Side Story he finds this remarkable hybrid between these different genres, only really comparable perhaps to what Gershwin achieved in the 1920s, 1930s. It's a similar talent for fusing together genres, something that's very difficult to do successfully, actually, to really make that work so that the genres do fuse properly and they don't feel awkward or sort of kitsch. There's something kind of authentic about the fusion, and that's remarkable. So the point that I wanted to focus in on, this issue to do with tension and societal strife and so forth, seems to be represented by an interval, which is to say two notes sounding together. And the notes that Bernstein chooses to represent conflict to some extent, or to represent tension in the score, they form a tritone, which is that interval. This has for hundreds of years been an interval that's been associated with darkness or dissonance or even with the devil. It's an interval that's been called Diabolus in Musica. So it's long been considered imperfect because it's a semitone below a perfect fifth. And apart from the octave, the perfect fifth has always been considered the perfect interval in music. I mean, you think about medieval music where you might have Gregorian chant working with itself a fifth higher in parallel. We call that organum, the effect of fifths being sung together. But going a long way back, the perfect fifth has been considered a perfect interval, an appropriate interval for expressing divine text, that kind of thing. But the tritone, not so much. Tritone sounds a bit creepy and it's acoustically problematic. It's full of, I say it's problematic, it's just, it doesn't ring with the acoustic perfection of the fifth. This is all to do with the physics of sound, as a matter of fact, because a perfect fifth is a ratio of 2 to 1, so it has this very beautiful sonority, this lovely resonance. The tritone sounds dissonant. Anyway, this tension that's explored in the score, I'll show you a few examples, and I'll also show you how Bernstein uses that tension within the romance that's at the heart of the film. So I'll start by illustrating this with the first song that we hear, and in fact it's the music that you hear in the kind of overture of West Side Story, which is the music of the Jets. And the way that Bernstein sets this and represents the Jets with this kind of jaunty swung melody is to have the in A major, but it has this tritone embedded in it, so there's something a bit unsettling about it, about the line. You've got an A major triad, but then you've got a note that doesn't fit with the harmony. Does this. Oh, it turns to the minor there. So we get this sort of marvellously awkward harmony, and then we hear the response, and then this kind of bitonal passage where it's quite close to the kind of thing Ravel was writing in the 30s, where the left and right hands, they actually sound magnificent together because they form these harmonies, but they're also slightly out of joint with each other. And then we get this lovely resolution. You notice the rhythm isn't resolved either. So although we're going 1, 2, 1, 2, as in 1, 2, so that's the pulse. The rhythm in the left hand is in threes. So we got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So there's that sort of rhythmic dislocation as well as the dislocation of the harmony and the intervals. So my second example is from a song called Cool, also associated with the Jets. The lyric is boy, boy, crazy boy. So again, you've got this interval of a fifth, but it's being subverted. The dominant interval in the song is the tritone. Again, it's a really weird interval for anyone to sing, but Bernstein makes it work. Boy, boy, crazy boy, get cool, boy. And then we get the answer. And so on. So you've got that kind of marvellously tense vocal line. It's also rather groovy.
Groovy, baby!
But the general presence of the tritone is there all the way through, and at the end of the song, Bernstein, he's so clever, he's showing off, a bit like Mozart does. Bernstein shows off at the end of the song by having a little fugue. So the fugue goes, so you get the interval of the song, then the fugue subject, and then the answer. Then you get all these so all these wonderful slow fugue subjects, a bit like you get in, say, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, where the subject keeps coming in semi-breves. But the subject itself, or Beethoven's Grosse Fuge is another subject, which is a little bit like this. You've got a semitone, a seventh up, and then a semitone down, very like the Grosse Fuge. And the answer is within a tritone. There's an a semitone drop, a fifth up, and a semitone down, which gives you the tritone. So again, we've got this tritone harmony, and lots of dissonances with all these seconds all over the place. Here's a quick example of a third one. This is a sort of popular song melody, but grafted on top of a slightly unsettling bass line. So again, that creates a tritone in the bass. So it's a very similar sort of harmonic tension. Right, let's talk a little bit about the more romantic elements, which also involve the tritone. And my first example of a more hopeful character coming through is Could It Be? Marvellous song, one of the most inspired songs in the show. The whole song has this kind of wonderful energy, and yet the whole thing is sung in this kind of still quietness. Occasionally Bernstein uses the string section in this very rich scoring just to underpin the vocal parts. It's a great song. But again, the main interval is the tritone. Could it be? So it's the combination of the C, the pedal note C, and that F sharp. You might say it has a Lydian character. Lydian scale is the one that has a raised fourth. So the whole thing has this obsessive return to the tritone. Now, we've come to the, if you like, the climactic example of the tritone in the drama, and it's used here to represent the kind of flowering of romance between the two main characters. I've forgotten their names.
Tony and Maria.
It represents the flowering of the two main characters. We've got Tony, who's on one side. It's like Romeo and Juliet. So Tony comes from one side and Maria, who comes from the other side. And so that in their relationship is the tension made manifest in effect. Now, of course, like so many of these great dramas, therefore there's the promise of hope and reconciliation and peace and all these other things. If human beings would only embrace the redemptive power of love, all these stories are telling us, then the world would resolve many of its problems. And of course, the fact that these stories are so often tragedies is because often those forces overwhelm the powers of hope and the possibility of reconciliation. Not always, there is always the possibility of reconciliation, and these stories perhaps do tell us that there is a possibility. And here, embedded in this beautiful song, you'll remember that it starts up with this wonderful and bold and daring repetition of her name, Maria, Maria, Maria. And then we get the beautiful shift to E flat major. So that interval is our tritone. It's the Lydian effect of E flat major, but with this tritone against it. So in effect, the same interval that underpins the dark music in West Side Story also underpins the romantic music, which I think is rather a brilliant device. My final example, because otherwise it'll get boring. And my final example is from one of the richest and most interesting passages in West Side Story, and one of my favourites, which is the beautiful and complex duet between Maria's kind of sister-in-law, the girlfriend of her brother, Anita, and Maria. They have this extraordinary duet because Maria's brother has been killed by her boyfriend, Tony, in a fight. And so there's this terrible moment of absolute sort of tension as the two women confront each other, or Anita confronts Maria. And she sings this song called A Boy Like That. A boy like that who'd kill your brother. Forget that boy and find another. That's the text. The text, incidentally, is by Stephen Sondheim, who himself was a great composer of musical theatre. So you got two geniuses of musical theatre working together. And the text, it's got these fabulously dissonant harmonies. These sort of really pungent chords, and they have this amazing set too where the text of one song is sung by Anita and then a different text with a different tempo. Of course, they're metrically fused together. They're sung together simultaneously. It's one of these great moments in musical theatre where two people apparently singing different emotions, different kinds of text and different kinds of music. Something that Mozart was very good at, that Bernstein picks up on that talent in West Side Story. It's a beautiful duet. And then the mood changes in the second half because Maria then breaks into this beautiful song, I Have a Love and It's All That I Have. One of the most touching moments in the show. Let me just play you how that goes, where she sings I Have a Love. She sings, I love him, I'm his. So, famous refrain. And then we change key. Now watch this. Beautiful harmonies. Right or wrong? It's this chord, which is the same as the earlier one. Now, do you notice that the climactic chord right at the heart of the melody? Who else, I can't think of any other musical composer who have written such a profoundly dissonant chord at the climax of a kind of love song. And do you notice what it is? It's the chord of E flat major set against a bass note, a tritone apart from it. So you've got that tritone tension right there in the heart of the song harmonically. And the fascinating thing is that as you reach that chord with each phrase, it's a kind of, it gives you a thrill. It doesn't make you think, oh, what an ugly chord. It's somehow judged and calculated in just the right way to have a kind of heart-swung effect on the audience. It's a magnificent gesture. And incidentally, right at the end of the show, and I mean the end, the very final bars of the piece, he restates this thing, this song, and we hear this epilogue, this lamenting epilogue, because Tony's been killed at the end of the show, and it's a very somber atmosphere. Right at the end, we hear the motif of There's a Place for Us, just played as a little canon. And then here, there's our tritone from the song that I've just been showing you. C major, F sharp in the bass, and finally C major without the F sharp, as if there is a promise, there's a possibility of hope away from the tritone. The fascinating thing I should say here is that Bernstein is showing all his literate credentials as an incredibly knowledgeable musician, because this relationship between C and F sharp is in fact an old one, goes right back to Wagner's Ring. Wagner in Götterdämmerung, I think he pioneered this tense sound of C major against F sharp in Hagen's kind of proto-fascist aria at the end of Götterdämmerung. Extraordinary music with these F sharps plunging down in the bass and these horn calls above it. Very, very disturbing, extraordinary idea. And then Stravinsky, who knew and revered Wagner when he was a teenager, he kind of reacted against Wagner later, but he was obviously influenced by that famous passage, because in Petrushka, his great ballet of 1911, you have the same tension, F sharp against C major. So that marvellous effect of the harmony of C crashing into the harmony of, literally crashing into the harmony of F sharp major. So you've got these two harmonies a tritone apart. And I think Bernstein was very aware of these prior examples of great scores which use that conflict, that tritone conflict, to represent tension. In Wagner, it's the sort of political tension. In Petrushka, it's the tension that the puppet Petrushka has when he comes alive and realizes that he's in love with another puppet who's come alive, and someone else wants her as well. So there's that sort of terrible marionette struggle. Very weird, but magnificently coloured by Stravinsky. But in Bernstein, perhaps the most affecting of the three examples from the point of view of this sort of doomed love and the promise, ultimately the promise of the possibility of redemption. But whatever that possibility, whatever that hope is in West Side Story, it lies beyond the drama itself, which has in fact ended in tragedy, just as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet ended in tragedy several hundred years before. So there we have a very brief glimpse of West Side Story, very brief glimpse of Leonard Bernstein in all his greatness and multifacetedness. And enjoy the movie. I hope it'll be fun. Let me know your thoughts about Bernstein and about the movie in the comments below. Thanks for watching.